Hello, friends. Lee Henson Hasty. I know it's a little later than you thought, but it's Holy Week. I mean, there's got to be grace in Holy Week, and there's been a lot of grace this week because Jenny McDevitt graciously agreed to join me in Holy Week, and she's a pastor at Shandon Presbyterian Church in Columbia, South Carolina. Thank you, Jenny, for being here in your office, even.
Yes, yep. It's great to be with you. It's a nice break in my frantic preparations. So this time I can say, well, it's not done because Lee asked me to do something instead of it's not done because I just don't have it done. So,
there you go.
Thank you.
gives you 45 minutes or 30 minutes. We're here, and thank you again. And we were just talking Easter. There was a walkthrough just before this. Are we looking forward to already looking past Good Friday toward Easter?
We are looking at all three at the same time. We're living in a that little paradox of working on it all at once. But
we had our Easter worship service at the foundation today. Jerry Cannon preached for us, and
nice.
We talked about it being kind of an in-between time. Well, I'm saying it's still Lent, but I have a little white too. I have a little purple and white today.
Very nice.
But I'm grateful for your being here. Jenny is with me here. We're going to be talking about writing as spiritual discipline. It's something she does as a writer. She is just writes. I mean, we'll talk about this practice, and please let us know if you're here in the comments, if you have questions, what have you. We'd love that. Looks like Glenn Bella's already here. Glenn prayed at our service earlier. So keep praying out there, Glenn. We are just, we're glad to be here during Holy Week. It's how I start each show, and I think you know this. Howard Thurman was someone who informed Katie Geneva Cannon, who was one of your professors at Union Presbyterian Seminary. And Howard Thurman asked, what is it that's making you come alive? But Katie said it a little bit differently, is what is the work your soul must have? And so as a Kenyon College graduate and creative writing major, as a field hockey player, I was going to say it, on the field hockey team, as a reader of Tina Fey, Bossy Pants.
You have done some dangerous internet research,
right,
my friend.
I try as the editor of the Kenyon College Collegian, year 2000, and graduate of Union Presbyterian Theological Seminary. What is the work your soul must have, Jenny McDevitt?
Yeah, I love that question. And because Dr. Cannon was my professor, I do think about it from time to time. And I think the most direct and distilled answer is that I'm a storyteller. The story of the gospel, the stories that other people share with me and are gracious to let me then share more broadly. Sometimes my own story. But I think there's a lot of power in stories, and I'm really one of the luckiest people I know that I get to do that professionally,
right.
Even. So storytelling, yeah.
Yeah, you've served in a variety of contexts: Kansas City Village Church, Prairie Village, Kansas City area, Madison Avenue Church in New York City, and now Columbia. And storytelling, I think people know you as a writer and a preacher. They really love your words. Jessica Tate, will go ahead and let everybody know, is the one who sort of brought us together. And Jessica, just speaks there's almost a hushed tone in her voice when she talks about your words. So, and I mean, if you don't know, Jenny is on Instagram with sharing some of these words in a writing.lightly, if you want to follow that. So you do, when you read some of those prayers and liturgies and just I don't know that you can even describe some of the posts you have there. It does feel like a story, and there's some autobiography happening there. It feels like, I mean, the wall across from you, or the window, or the dog, or I mean, and it's beautiful. I mean, so you really start. That's part of your creative process. What is happening right where you are, I guess.
It is, yeah. And I think there's pros and cons to that. I think most people who write do have some degree of, how much of a narcissist can I possibly be? That people might want to read about that.
Right.
But in college, my creative writing degree, I wanted originally to follow the creative nonfiction track, but I got accepted into the creative fiction track. And that was wonderful, but also a struggle, because really I wanted to write about what was actually happening instead of making up my own arc about something.
Right.
So I've always tended more towards that, I think.
Well, and so by your senior year, you're the editor of the, the college newspaper, so you showed them.
Yeah.
And so how do you make time for writing? What is it? I mean, how do you? That's something I think, particularly pastors who often listen to our show, if they're listening now or listening later, they're always looking for, like, when am I going to do this writing that I've got to do? But you have some ideas about that, I know.
Yes. So part of it is I am an early riser, and so I get quite a bit of writing done in the morning before the world can intervene. I realize that's, everyone has their own schedules. But I think in all of my different churches and contexts, I kind of learned there's all sorts of times and moments in ministry that we get to connect with people and influence people, or offer them a thought or a word. Worship is one of the times that you can do that with the most people. And so I really do try to set time aside, particularly for writing. And sometimes that cuts into my own life. But I'm fortunate to have been places where they are very receptive to my saying, there will be time in my week
that's beautiful.
That I need to write.
Right.
And I would say that when I'm at my best, I put as much time into the printed liturgy as I do. Maybe not exactly the same amount of time, but quite a bit of time into printed liturgy, because I'm mindful that's where we're asking the gathered people to speak words out loud, and to give them opportunity to speak the gospel out loud can be transformative.
100%.
So I try really hard to give really careful thought and consideration to those words, because it's a different thing to put my words in someone else's mouth than just in my own.
Right. And a real privilege. I think it's a beautiful way to think about it. I remember my pastor growing up, Stuart Yandel, if anybody knows him. Actually, he served a church in Charleston and then Monroe. He would say he spent as much or more time on his pastoral prayer as he did his sermon, and you could tell, by the way. But
I interpret that in a beautiful way.
It was a beautiful way. Loved him. I mean, but I think that's, so reformed of you to think of that way too. I mean, this is liturgy and worship is the work of the people, and so you're helping to guide and shape them. Often, whether it's a digital bulletin or one they're holding on to that's printed, it is also something people hold on to. I have visited, and you probably have too. You'll visit with people, and they have they hold on to those bulletins in their cars, sometimes in their homes. It's a almost holy piece of paper. So
yeah, it always startles me in a very humbling and beautiful way when I see, someone has saved that, or refers to it later.
So when you started writing back in college, and you were doing the creative writing thing, even though you were interested in the other thing, what was it that you wrote about then? Just to get the kind of arc of your creativity here. And
Well,
I knew you were writing before then too, I'm sure, but I'm just thinking that's a good starting spot.
yeah. Well, in the pieces that I submitted to be admitted into the program, because Kenyon's a small school, so there's only so many professors.
Right.
Everything. Everything I wrote and
great
submitted,
school, by the
way. Thank you. Everything I submitted was very much autobiographical. And so they pulled out little sentences here and there, and they said, "Oh my gosh, the way you phrased that, we want you in this class over here." So that was entertaining to me. That in telling the story of my own life, I got admitted into a fiction class. Interpret as you wish.
You're right.
But it was a struggle for me in some ways. I really would find myself trying to write a fictional account of something that I really had done. Which at the ripe old age of like 18 and 19, not super interesting.
Right.
Or honestly, just very thinly veiled. Like my professor would always be like, "I feel like this is something you did, not something you imagined." And I'm a terrible liar too. So I would just say, yes.
It is.
But in some ways, I think it probably stretched my creativity and imagination a little bit more, even if it wasn't a supernatural place for me to land.
Right.
But I wrote short stories. Sorry, that was probably what you wanted to know.
Yeah, you ended up writing short stories. Okay. Have you published some of those? Some of those been published? Oh, that needs to come around.
Oh, all of us ought to have something we look back at and go, that was really lovely, and it is even lovelier that it's in the past. And not on the internet.
Well, it had to be part of your call to ministry too. This sort of love of, writing. You kind of have to love it. Because you do a lot of it in pastoral ministry if you do it well. Right. So that had to be part of your call. Is that true?
I think slowly, or maybe it always was, and I was just slow to realize it. I went to seminary absolutely adamant that I would not be a pastor because I couldn't imagine figuring out something to say to people so consistently.
Right.
Now every church I've ever been at, they're like, "Really? You had a hard time coming up with words? You have no shortage of words."
Right.
But I think once I got to seminary and started engaging that process, it very quickly shifted what the direction I was headed in.
Right. And it was the time that liturgy started. That was sort of one of the first places, and where you still have some energy is around writing liturgy, prayers and responsive readings. You've done this for, conferences, Massonato, Montreat. I'm not exactly sure how leading recreation for the Montreat Youth Conference, if that is liturgy writing or what that is exactly.
Oh God. It was fun, and I have let them know I have retired from that.
Okay, my life. All right. That's like liturgy with your body, I think.
Sure, that is the most graceful way you could have connected those two things, possibly. Yes, so I really and truly got a consistent start with that at Village Church when I was there. Village is a big church, multi-staff. I did not preach often. And a couple of years after I got there, there was a stretch of time when we were a little short-staffed, and Tamar invited me to start writing the Printed Liturgy. And he said, "I think you're good at that." And so it became part of my job the rest of the time I was there. So for about 4.5 years,
Wow.
Something like that. I wrote the weekly liturgy.
Wow,
for
that's a
Village.
lot.
It was, and at first it was like really fun, and I never thought it was, taxing or anything. But when you do it every week, it, there were times when it came really easily, and times when I thought I have nothing more to say about how we will confess our sins this week.
Right, I was going to say the confession of sin. That's the
but
hard.
and I know this was this isn't frequently the situation, but because I wasn't preaching, and I kind of missed that, I was able to, dig into the text that I knew the preacher was using, and really do almost a little bit of, preaching preparation.
Sure, exegetical kind of work. Yeah.
Yeah. So it was kind of an outlet for that. And it, I think enabled me to stay in a role where I wasn't preaching for a while. And then, I think, and Tom also gave me a lot of space to try different things, to do a style of prayer we'd never done before, or I got to the point where I would tell a story to introduce the prayer of confession every week. And the parameters I set for myself were, it has to be some moment that I experienced grace since last Sunday.
Great question.
And so I really did limit myself to where in this past week did I encounter grace. And so I would then tell that story as a way of introducing the prayer of confession. And so a little bit of a reverse, like I tend to say we can confess honestly because we know that grace is real, preemptively.
Right.
But it really, I wasn't as, I didn't quite realize what it would grow into, but it got to the point where I had lots of different people in the congregation who would tell me that they'd started looking for the moments in their lives.
Oh, that's beautiful. Yeah.
And then that's when I think I realized that, there is the potential for liturgy to be just as transformative, as a sermon.
Well, you saying that, I mean, it almost is just, I mean, a sermon typically is a little bit longer, kind of prose kind of thing. And with the liturgy, you're distilling down and editing. I mean, as a writer, you know this. I mean, I'm not the writer you are, but I live with a writer. So I know this, like the editing is the key, and distill down like a good question. I mean, is that part of what you do when you sit down to write, or you just let yourself? I mean, there's probably a number of different things you kind of pull out of your play chest or something. I mean, I don't know what you're doing.
It sort of depends, and not always on what I'm writing, but just how the day is gone. You know, sometimes I'm very particular, and I really don't write something down until I've tossed it around in my head and I know how I want it to sound. But usually there's a lot of words that go down, and then especially if it's a short prayer or just a little anecdote, lots, sometimes more than half of it ends up cut. And I used to just ache about that. And so I started this practice. I just have a running file of all the things that I have to cut, but that I really like. Someday
they may be resurrected.
Yeah. I mean, or I'll scroll through it sometimes and be like, oh, there was a great line about Pentecost. And, that actually shows up every year. So,
So are you doing most of your writing on a computer, or are you doing on paper? 100%. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I type way faster than I write.
Okay.
And
I guess everybody's a little different, but I mean, that's interesting because you can kind of it's easier to kind of hold on to it and have it accessible for kind of coming back. Do you you talked about early in the morning, a certain part of the day, a certain part of a week, a certain part of a month? I mean, do you have any rhythms that you would recommend to people, or just develop a rhythm?
Well, yes, I think the big thing is you have to find what works for you. I have found that morning is better for me. But I also don't have little kids that are asking anything of me in the morning. So I'm mindful of that. but I try to sit down and write all the liturgy for a season in 1 or 2.
Wow.
Because then I'm mindful, like,
then,
okay, this
then there's
day,
a connection. There's a thread.
Yeah. Because, and I tend to be a sermon series preacher. So I'm thinking about the series, and then I think, okay, I need 6 prayers of confession, and then I can think about, okay, well, this one is a little more personal. This one is a little more global, or, to try and cover some bases there. Now, I do not always succeed at that. That was a very aspirational thing.
And you're writing not just liturgy. I mean, you'll just sit down and write. I mean, I'm looking at Instagram. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff there. There are prayers, but there's other.
Yes. Things. What ends up on Instagram is mostly little poems. That's just what I call them, little poems.
Right.
And I started that Instagram feed with a very particular intent behind it. And it actually wasn't for liturgy. I do post some prayers there just because people ask for them. But I am an incredibly slow sermon writer. I can throw down so much stuff all the time, but when it comes to writing a sermon and just like committing to something and going for it, I'm super slow. And so my intent with writing this way was I give myself 15 minutes.
15 minutes. That's good.
There's a couple that have been a little more tied to current events that I have let myself write and then sit with it to make sure that seems like an appropriate thing to put into the world.
So I've loved the pieces about the Ukraine, and I know that's very much on people's minds. The prayer that starts, by the way, our God will help in ages past, our hope for years to come. I mean, I used that prayer for a gathering recently, and I mean, I almost didn't make it through it. I just have to tell you. And I love this one for March 12th. It was Thursday is what you titled it. It was Thursday when Russia invaded Ukraine, and I wondered what I would say to the congregation that gathers every Sunday. Not because my words would change anything, but because heartbreak deserves to be acknowledged and dragons deserve to be shouted down. Okay, that's just a taste, y'all. There's more. I won't read everything. Go to writing.lightly on Instagram. It's just, that's beautiful. It's also you're processing some things happening in your head. I mean, you literally are like, what in the world is happening, and what in the world can I say this Sunday? I mean, this is what preachers are usually saying on Thursday. They're saying it for Easter right now for about Easter. I know.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. But so most and all of those really, I do write them in a very short period of time. It's just some of them I let sit. But honestly, trying to train myself to be, to trust what I write down, or to recognize that, sometimes what we write is just an offering for what it is. It doesn't have to be immensely polished, or every word doesn't have to be perfect.
I'm wondering who has shaped you as a writer. Are there heroes, are there heroines, are there mentors, are there pastors? I mean, who do you sort of admire? I mean, I think good writers know other good writers. So people get ready, because your book list may grow right here.
Well, so Lee did tell me about this question in advance, which I appreciate. And I was trying to be, some of these are so expected, but I guess if you're good, and everybody knows it. In terms of liturgy and prayers and things like that, Jim Lowry, who's a Presbyterian pastor, his book Prayers for the Lord's Day was really instructive to me, and I sometimes will borrow a phrase here and there, with attribution, but so he's one, and I didn't actually know this until I came here, but he served at Shandon for a short period of time.
Wow. Yeah, very cool.
And like every good Presbyterian, I do love some Frederick Buechner.
Sure.
And now I just sound like a crazy person, but he actually attended church at Madison Avenue.
Wow. Wow.
So,
did you know he was going to be there? I mean, you did.
Oh, no, not when I was there, but that's where he,
okay.
Before he went to seminary, that's where he went to church. And so he was sitting in the pews there when he decided to go to seminary.
Oh, wow.
So that, I mean, that kind of has reinforced my affection for him. But,
Sure.
And then, you know, I read Barbara Brown Taylor and I wonder why any of us try. I mean, you know, like she's just gold.
She shapes words so beautifully. I had her on the show. It was just a podcast if folks haven't listened. And yeah, she is a master with words and images. I mean, it feels like you're like inside her head or something when you listen to her. I mean, it is inspiring.
Well, I feel like from her, she sort of gives permission to imagine inside the story,
right?
Like beyond what the text itself might say,
right?
And I find that to be a really fulfilling part of my process, even if it never shows up anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And then I would be remiss to not mention, you know, Tamar and Roger Nishioka.
Oh, sure.
I have been fortunate to work with some.
Yes.
Because they're my friends, I tell them they are stupid talented.
We get that.
But they, you know, I both learned a lot from working with them and listening to them. But they also were very affirming and really gave me space to try something.
Any singer-songwriters? I didn't ask you that. I didn't prep you on that.
Well, no. So one person that comes to mind, they're not a singer-songwriter, but a spoken word poet.
Okay.
Andrea Gibson.
Okay.
Uses they, them pronouns. But I often will say if I had to pick one person I would like to learn to write like when I grow up, it would be them.
Wow. I love that.
I think
Andrea Gibson. I don't know that.
Uses words like no one I have ever encountered.
Wow.
It's
Okay.
Really beautiful.
Okay. So, you heard it here first, people. When the well is dry. That's what we're talking about here, really. I should say when the well is dry.
That's going to be my sort of non-answer to the singer-songwriter question.
Okay.
Spoken word poet.
Spoken word poets.
Yeah.
And a lot of what you do, right? I mean, you're writing for spoken word. I mean, that's you kind of have that in mind. You realize a lot of what you do. I mean, the Instagram certainly is you know, two-dimensional, but it also, I mean, I feel like it's meant to be spoken out loud. A lot of what you write.
Yeah, and that's probably the biggest shift. I mean, when I started writing, it was all solely to be read. But through liturgy and preaching and even with that Instagram account, I mean, literally everything I write now, even Outlook columns that are never read out loud, I am constantly saying my words out loud. Because you hear them differently, or especially if it's words that will be spoken. Sometimes it looks really good on paper, and then you try to say the words and it's too many of the same sounds together, or, you know, that you just wouldn't catch if. So I suppose part of my process is to mumble to myself and look probably a little deranged.
You're making me feel better. I do the same thing. I can't believe our time. I'm looking at our time. It's gone away here. I mean, I'm asking if there are comments, if anybody has any. We'd love to hear from you. I'm glad Lee Young joined us. Nancy Crow, who's a writer. I went to seminary. Nancy's a beautiful writer. Thanks for everybody for being here with us. We'll be back in 2 weeks. I believe that's August 27th. And guest yet to be confirmed. You know, it's Lent, so things are moving a little slower right now. So, but be on the lookout for that. I'm going to invite Jenny to offer a benediction here momentarily, if you're willing. But if there are folks out there who have comments or questions, I want you to have a moment at least to get those in. I didn't ask you earlier. I'm glad you were here. People are asking, will this be posted? Yes, this is posted, or it'll be on YouTube and in the Facebook group, Theological Education Fund, and also the podcast, Leading Theologically. I didn't really even introduce myself fully. I'm Lee Henson Hasty. I'm the Senior Director of Theological Education Funds Development for the Presbyterian Foundation. That's a ministry of the Committee on Theological Education. So that's why we're here. That's how you can find this. It will not be typed up, although your benediction will. I mean, no pressure. You're used to having your prayers printed, so I'm not too nervous about that. Mm-hmm. Thanks everybody for being here. Truly, Julie Bailey, I see you, and Nancy is affirming the story before a confession is a great idea. I think that's true. A story about grace. So we'll just may have to have you come back because they're loving you so much here.
After Holy Week.
After all, still can't even believe it. Thanks again for being here. And if you would offer us a benediction, that would be most appreciated.
Yes, and thank you for having me. And so the benediction I use every week, I have to give credit to another writer, is actually not my own words. Carson Brisson was my Hebrew professor at Union, and I know time is up, so I'm going to talk quickly. At the end of our first day of Hebrew class, he looked out at us, and I think we were all like questioning every decision we ever made throughout our entire lives. And he offered us a benediction that day, and he does that. He uses roughly the same words with every class. It has evolved over the years, but the one that I use is the one he used for my class.
Beautiful.
And I asked him years ago if I could use it, and he said, "Oh, yes." And I told him not too long ago that I still use it every week, and he just looked at me and he was like, "Well, surely you can do better than that." But I have always loved it. So receive this benediction, my friends. Mm-hmm. May joy and nothing less follow you all the days of your life. May you be blessed, and may you be a blessing, and may you rest well today, secure in the knowledge that the Lord of light, who has brought you this far already, will lead you and countless others all the way home. Amen.
Amen. What a light you are, Jenny. You truly live into that blessing, and thanks for the gift you are as a writer, as a person, as a field hockey player, as a leader, as a preacher, as a friend and colleague in ministry. Thank you for the gift that you are, and blessings to you and yours, especially this Holy Week. And friends, we look forward to seeing you again soon. Stay in touch. Take good care.